Hello, this is Dr. Adam Weiss, and we are here to have another video lecture for the class curriculum in the young child. And today we're going to be focusing on the language domain, or how young children learn language and effective language arts instructional techniques. So let's first begin by how babies learn and develop their oral language. And so remember, oral language is listening and speaking. And those are the two language domains that people develop first. First, they develop listening, and then they develop speaking. And then later, they'll develop reading, and then finally, they'll develop writing. So let's talk about first how babies develop listening skills and speaking skills. So, babies first initially have exposure to the different phonemes or sounds in the English language in the womb and also shortly after birth. And they have exposure to that by listening to their adult caregivers speak to them. Babies first start to babble or baby talk at 4 months, and by about 1 year, they can start to say individual words that are real words, and they'll also start to babble in complete sentences. So most of those words in that sentence will actually be made up words with a few real words thrown in. By ages 1 through 2, babies will have very strong receptive abilities or listening comprehension skills, and those abilities will be much more developed than their expressive ability. By 18 months, babies will be learning 12 new words a day, and they'll be able to speak about 9 to 20 words out loud. They'll also understand most of the sounds or phonemes in the English language, about 80%. Children who are ages 2 through 3 will be able to speak from 200 to 1,000 words, although they'll be able to understand through listening from 2,000 to 3,000 words. They'll also start to appreciate rhymes and words that have repetition. They'll also begin to speak in short, complete sentences, and if they will be meaningful sentences, there won't be any more baby talk, it'll be real words. Another thing is that they'll often start to notice that each object, item, or person has a specific name. So they'll start to be interested in that and want to find out the unique names of each item, person, or thing. They'll ask, what is that? By age 3 through 5, babies can, or now they're not babies, toddlers and preschool students can now speak about 1,000 words, and their vocabulary increases rapidly. So they're developing new vocabulary words every day. They'll also, however, still overgeneralize certain words based on their understanding of grammar rules, and so they'll assume that all grammar rules are the same. So they won't really understand the idea of irregular words. So, for example, take the word fish. Fish is an irregular word, and that has an irregular plural. Normally with plural words, plural nouns like cat, we add the S at the end, cats. Well, fish, if we don't add the S, it just stays fish. So it's irregular. But children who are at that age will often make the mistake to add an S to it or add an ES. So fishes or fishes. So students will make that mistake when it should just be fish. It's an irregular plural. Same thing with verbs that end in the ED in the past tense. So most verbs, action verbs, end in the ED, like play, talk, walk. They all end in ED. Played, walked, talked in the past tense. However, there are some verbs that are irregular. So, like make is irregular. It doesn't become made in the past tense, it's made. Or sit becomes sat. So, students might unfortunately group their understanding of past tense verbs to every verb, even when there's irregulars. Another thing is that students will start to realize that words can be broken down into smaller units, like prefixes, suffixes, or morphemes, and students will start to combine different parts of words to make new words. So they might understand the idea that re means to do again. So they might say words like replay or remake or recook. And those will be accurate words. And so they're starting to combine different combinations of words. They're starting to really recognize the nuances of language. By age 5 through 7, children have about 1,000 words, and their vocabulary is, of course, growing. They're going to start to realize that words can have more than one meaning, although they'll also struggle with some pronunciation of consonants like the L, R, and the consonant blend SH sounds. They'll be able to hold complete conversations, and they'll be able to use language for specific purposes, for example, to persuade others, or to tell their point of view, or to express their emotions. And they'll start to make connections with the oral language they know, the listening and speaking, and connecting it to their emergent literacy, their reading and writing skills. They'll also, for the most part, have a syntactic ability equal to adults. So they'll recognize and be able to speak in complete sentences. And they'll understand when a person is speaking in complete sentences and the different parts of speech. They might not actually know that play is called a verb, but they'll realize that play is an action. Or that she is a noun. They might not know the term noun yet, but they'll understand that she refers to a person. When students get 7 years or older, their grammar is basically at an adult level. They still, once again, might not know all of the names of the different grammatical terms, but they will be able to speak in grammatically correct ways, and they'll be able to, for the most part, if they are native speakers and they've been educated in that language, they'll be able to follow the grammatical rules even when it comes to like irregular verbs or irregular words. They'll also start to really become interested in talking. They'll especially enjoy elaborating and describing things that they enjoy. And in order for students to remain on grade level, they need to learn about 3,000 new vocabulary words each year. So teachers have to provide explicit vocabulary instruction to make sure that students are keeping up with the academic language that they'll need for upcoming grades. So let's now talk about how babies best learn oral language. Well, babies best learn oral language from direct interaction with adults. So they, for the most part, especially young babies, ages 0 to 2, for the most part, they will not learn language from the TV or from the radio per se. They'll primarily learn it through looking at an adult, seeing that the adult recognizes them and is paying attention to that baby, and the adult is talking to that baby or communicating. So face-to-face conversations are the most effective way to develop babies' oral language development. They've also found, research shows that babies' oral language development, even by the age of 3, can have a huge effect and can even predict students' later academic success, like in high school and their later adult reading ability. So this is really important that we develop students' oral language skills and their vocabulary even at an early age, and that we have regular face-to-face conversations and we regularly read to students. Because, unfortunately, there is a significant discrepancy in the amount of vocabulary words known by students of different socioeconomic backgrounds. So research shows that when you compare students growing up in poverty to students who grow up in affluent, high-income households, the high-income students have more than 4 times the vocabulary as low-income students. And so this is very problematic because if we don't bridge this gap, then we could perpetuate and continue this cycle of poverty where people who grew up poor develop a lower vocabulary, struggle with their reading, have lower literacy skills, and then end up having difficulty getting out of poverty. And so we as educators have to make sure that we are having these regular face-to-face conversations. We're reading to students, like I said earlier. We are having students talk with each other. They're having interactive conversational situations rather than just being set in front of a TV or when they're playing games, they're encouraged to talk about what they're playing. All of these things can help develop students' oral language skills. So there's some important oral language skills that young children will learn when they're very young, and this will help build a foundation to their success in their future learning. So, for example, listening. Students at an early age, even age 2 through 5, will need to start realizing the importance of paying attention to the speaker and also focusing on what the speaker is saying, focusing on comprehending the message of that speaker. In addition, they'll have to learn the speaking skills of developing necessary vocabulary to be specific, and also being able to understand the different language structures and how to express verbally their needs and their opinions to others. When they start to read, but even when they're being read to at the age of at a young age, but when they start to read at from ages 4 and onward, it'll be very important that they see the need to connect their prior knowledge to what they're reading, as well as analyze clues such as visual clues like pictures, oral clues like what they're hearing out loud or what they've heard from other people, or clues from the manner in which the language is used, linguistic clues, to help understand text. Furthermore, at about the age of 4, they're going to start to develop essential fundamental writing skills like understanding the alphabetic system and how the alphabet is a symbolic way to communicate, and it's a way to communicate your message with others using symbols. And then they'll also need to learn viewing skills. So these viewing skills would be making sure that they recognize symbolic communication like pictures, or also digital communication like print on computers, or print that they hear out loud through the radio or through CDs or digital recordings. And then even different forms of digital communication like text, blogging, researching, online encyclopedia posts like Wikipedia. So they're learning to understand and interpret those different digital communication tools. So now we have to also think about the importance of these early literacy experiences that many children will have, because they will set the foundation to their formal literacy development. So if you think about it, many children develop exposure to literacy at an early age. They flip through the pages of picture books, they hear stories read out loud to them. They might later, when they're hopefully ages 3 or 4, later when they're emotionally and their attention span is developed enough, they can start to watch educational programs on TV like Sesame Street that teach alphabet and literacy skills. They'll start to notice environmental print in their outside, so they'll see billboards, they'll see signs, they might read labels. They'll also be paying attention to seeing their adults read, so seeing their adults write down grocery lists, read from the grocery list, read labels, read mail, write letters, write emails, read books for pleasure. All of these things students are observing adults do. And they'll also start to draw pictures and scribbles. And those pictures and those scribbles, even though they might appear very rudimentary to you as a proficient writer, that is actually the first stage of writing, is scribbling and recognizing that they can make marks on the paper and that those marks have meaning. So now we're going to talk about how we can link students' oral language development to their developing or emerging literacy skills. So first of all, preschool and kindergarten students need to develop phonological awareness. And phonological awareness is basically the ability to recognize sounds, so phonemic awareness, and it's also the ability to break down language into individual parts and to alter language, to manipulate language based on your purpose. So this is the way students develop phonological awareness. First of all, they start to recognize words that rhyme, and they'll start to create rhymes. Second, they'll start to think about segmentation within sentences, how each sentence has different words, and each word is its own unique element. They'll also start to recognize that there's differences between the subject of a sentence and the predicate, which would be the verb and the object. So one way students do this, and they start recognizing this, is through listening to nursery rhymes. So if you think about Jack and Jill, that has segmentation. So Jack and Jill, that's the subject, went up the hill, that's the predicate. And so anyway, when they practice those different nursery rhymes and they're hearing them over and over, it's teaching them the forms and the structure of sentences, or segmentation. Next, they'll start to develop onset and rhyme. So they'll start to recognize that words that have similar endings, even though they start with a different syllable, can still be rhyming words, like cat, bat, rat. They all end with the AT, even though their syllable, the initial, not syllable, but the initial consonant. So when it says different starting syllables, I meant different starting consonants. So so in all those words, cat, bat, and rat, they have different consonants, C, B, and R respectively, but they have the same ending. For that reason, they're still rhyming words. Another thing is students will start to develop phonemic awareness. That's the fourth step. So they'll start to understand the different sounds of language. They'll start to also sequence the sounds and realize that they can make new words or or decode words, but break down words and sound them out based on their knowledge of the different sounds in a language, also their knowledge of different blends, how different sounds work together, and then how they can even manipulate sounds. So here are some specific ways that you, as an educator or as a parent, as an adult, a caring adult that wants to support your child's or your student's oral language development and subsequent literacy development, can do. So these are steps that you can use to link oral language to emerging literacy. So first of all, you as either the teacher or a parent or a caregiver can read students' books, and when you're reading books, try to find books that have rhymes, and that will help develop students' phonological awareness. Also, make sure that you're having regular conversations with children. If you're the teacher, having them with your students, or if you're a parent, having them with your own children. And then also encourage students to have regular discussions with their peers. Not only during class time, but also during free activities like recess or PE class or art class, encouraging students to discuss topics relevant to what they're learning and what they're experiencing using language, because that will allow students to learn from their peers and develop their vocabulary that way. Also, they'll develop more confidence in their listening and speaking abilities, their communication skills. Another way that you can link oral language to literacy is to encourage alliteration games or songs. So you might play students songs or chants, or even have them create their own silly sentences that involve alliteration. So alliteration would be basically where within a sentence almost every word starts with the same syllable or the same letter. Not syllable, the same letter. I don't know why I keep on saying that. With the same letter. So Peter Piper picked a pack of pickled peppers. So they all start with the same letter, P. If students practice with those alliteration games, it'll help develop their phonemic awareness, their ability of sounds. Another thing is you want to make sure that students receive regular literacy activities in which they get to hear, say, and see language all at the same time. So one great way to do this is to provide or read to students big books in which they are watching you as you move your finger along the page, reading the book. They're hearing you say the words. Then they're also saying it out with you if they've heard that story repeatedly, or there's a part where they chant or they repeat with the teacher. They're saying it at the same time. So they're hearing, saying, and seeing language all at once. Another way you can help develop and link oral language to emerging literacy is encourage word games. So these could be like matching games. They could be interactive word walls. They could be word sorting. It could be students creating their own rhymes or their own stories and songs. Another thing is you could incorporate word segmentation activities into your lessons. So you could have young students count out the number of words, or you could have older children start to group words in a sentence based on having the same sound, starting sound, or having similar parts of speech. Another thing is you want to make sure that you incorporate language not only in your language arts block or your language arts classes, but also in all of your content areas. So you want to make sure that students have frequent opportunities to read not only fiction books or made-up books, but also expository or informational texts like nonfiction or even persuasive texts as well. And you want students to be reading those different texts not only in language arts class, but also in math class, science class, and social studies class, and other areas. So during your math class, or your science class, or your social studies class, or even art or music class, you can provide read-alouds where you read students books about the specific content area. So if you're learning about the different shapes, you might read them a book about shapes. Or if you're learning about the different animals in the local environment, you might read them a book about local animals. And so students are not only learning that content knowledge, but they're also developing their literacy skills. Also, even if you're teaching a non-language arts subject like math or social studies, you want to make sure that you regularly and explicitly teach new vocabulary words. And you want students to practice those new vocabulary words in different ways. So maybe saying the word, writing their own student-friendly definition, acting out the word, writing a sentence with the word, maybe finding the word in different texts, explaining the word to someone else. Think of examples of the word or synonyms of the word. All of those are ways to interact with the word and also learn that new vocabulary. And that new vocabulary will also help with their content knowledge because they'll better understand what you're teaching them in math, science, or social studies. Also, you want to make sure you provide print in all areas of the classroom and then also in all subjects. So you want to provide text for students to read and opportunities to write about what they've learned in math class, science class, social studies class, and in all classes. You also want to have frequent opportunities for students to discuss their content with their peers, to discuss their thinking or to explain their conclusions or their opinions to their peers in all content areas. So now we're going to get into some specific language domain teaching strategies. And some of these we've kind of touched on a little bit already, but this will be a little bit more of an elaboration. So some ways that you can help support students' language arts development or overall language development in your classroom, in your early childhood classroom, are to do the following. So first of all, you want to offer many activities for students to practice writing. Writing helps students become better readers. It also helps them express their opinion and learn new vocabulary words. And it also further develops their phonological and phonemic awareness because they're having to sound out words when they're spelling. So you want to encourage students to write and to try spelling words by sounding them out or practice writing, even if they're not fully accurate. So even if most of the words they write are misspelled, or even if they're not necessarily writing a complete sentence or it doesn't always make sense, you still want them to practice writing. And then also a great way for them to express their meaning and to see that their writing has meaning is for them to orally present what they wrote to you or to their peers or to the class. Another thing is you want to make sure you provide engaging, high-interest reading texts for students to read, because that will make the students develop a love of learning, and they'll make them find reading, they'll see the meaningfulness of reading, and they'll also develop just a personal interest in reading, which will help them read even outside the classroom. And the more students read, the more proficient they'll become as readers, and which will in turn help them become more proficient writers and overall students, better students. Another thing is, when you are supporting students in their independent reading, where they're reading on their own, make sure you find out their independent reading level and then provide them with texts that are on that level. So when students are reading on their own, you want to make sure that for the most part they know almost all the words they're reading and that they can read the text fluently without having to pause, and they still understand most of the things they're reading out. They're comprehending what they're reading. So if you give them a text and they don't know more than 5 words on a page, or it's taking them over maybe a minute or two to read a page, or they seem to not really understand what they're reading when you ask them what the book is about, then you need to go provide a lower level of books that students can read on their own. Because when students are reading on their own, you don't want them to struggle. You want them to be able to read it fluently and with comprehension. Later, when you're reading with students, you can challenge them and maybe introduce a text that's slightly above their ability level, because you can scaffold and help them pronounce unknown words, or you can explain new vocabulary words, or you can help provide guided questions or have them pause in their reading to reflect on what they're reading, which will help their comprehension. But when they're reading on their own, you want to make sure that they can be successful and that they're not struggling with their reading. Another thing is you want to directly explain the relationship between reading and writing and how both of them work hand in hand, how if they become strong readers, they'll be able to be good, proficient writers, and vice versa. When they're writing, it'll help them with their reading skills and with their communication skills. And the same thing could be true with composing. So when students are writing, they're also developing more comprehension of what they are talking about, so they'll become more knowledgeable. And even decoding, like if they're learning phonics skills or they're learning how to decode words, that's going to help them in their spelling and in their writing. So showing students the explicit links between various forms of literacy and how they support each other. Another thing is make sure you provide a variety of different types of instruction. You do not want to have only whole group instruction the whole time, because many students will be at different reading levels, and if you only provide on grade level whole group instruction, you're going to leave behind students that are reading below grade level and also students that are reading above grade level. So instead, you want to probably have in the early grades, pre-K through second, you want to have maybe half of your day be whole group instruction, and then the rest of the half be small group or individual instruction. So normally a great thing to do is to have blocks where maybe you might have 30 minutes of whole group instruction, and then you might have 30 minutes where students work in small groups, or they work with partners, or they work with you while others work with partners or in small groups or in centers. Or even you might even have times where you work individually one-on-one with students. But you want to provide frequent opportunities for students to have small group or individual learning experiences, because this allows you, the teacher, to further differentiate your instruction to meet that student's unique reading level and unique language needs. Also, if you're noticing that students are struggling and they're falling behind, many times schools have different tutoring or small group reading resources that they can provide. They might have reading specialists, they might have reading tutors, they might have senior citizen volunteers that come in and read with students, or they might have funding for you to teach and tutor your students after school in small groups. So find out ways and work with your administrator to provide that small group support for students, especially for students who are struggling. Because you don't want students to fall behind in the early grades, because the early grades are so fundamental to their future success. If students fall behind in the early grades in their reading, that can lead them to be struggling readers for the rest of their lives. So we want to instead help support those students so they're on grade level and proficient readers, and this will ensure that they're more successful academically and also more likely to graduate high school. Another thing is you want to make sure, and we kind of mentioned this already, but you want to encourage students at all stages of writing, and you want to refer to those students as writers. You want to explain to them that scribbling is a form of writing, that they're becoming writers, that when they're writing sentences, they're writers, they're trying to explain their point of view, they're describing things, they're sharing a story with people, they're informing others. All of these things are important abilities, and encourage students at all different stages of their writing. Not only encourage them when they're starting to be proficient writing, but even when they're just starting out and experimenting with writing. However, you can still, even when you're encouraging students to try out different levels of writing, you can also make sure that you are modeling accurate and proficient writing to students, and the same thing can be said for modeling proficient reading as well. So you can do read alouds to students where you model proficient reading, where you're pausing after each punctuation mark, you're reading with fluency, you're reading with expression, you're using reading strategies to reflect on what you're understanding about the text. You're doing a think aloud to explain, I don't know that vocabulary word, but let's see if I can find some clues in the sentence to help me understand the word. So you're modeling proficient reading practices to students. You also should model proficient writing practices for students as well. You should regularly write for students and show proficient writing. Show them the different elements of writing like capitalization and punctuation and correct spelling. And if you model proficient writing, students will start to understand it and take it to heart, and then they'll become more proficient writers. Another thing is you also want to model just accurate, appropriate, and rich language use in just your speaking to students. You want to use words, most of the words your students should be able to understand what you're saying, but you also want to throw in a few new words they haven't heard before and explain those words, or at least provide a lot of clues and context of the sentence for them to understand that new word. Of course, you want to speak in complete sentences to model students how to communicate in complete sentences. You want to speak descriptively, speak clearly, and of course use correct grammar, punctuation, and spelling when you're writing out what you say. Try to find different times of the day when they're teachable moments where you can just spontaneously stop what you're doing and have students have a discussion on what they've learned or how that's interesting, just to show them and that they can use their oral language communication skills to interact with others and to inform others of their point of view and to learn from each other. Another thing is when you're asking students questions, take what they say, and then when you hear what they've said, rephrase what students said using complete sentences and using more academic vocabulary terms, and that will introduce students to new vocabulary words and to proper pronunciation and proper phrasing and how to speak in complete sentences with details. But it'll also recognize that you were paying attention to what that student said. So you're reaffirming what the student said and encouraging them that way, but you're also modeling to them proficient communication. Another thing is you want to regularly have learning activities each day in which students either describe events or objects or pictures, they make predictions, or they discuss new ideas or new things they've learned. And many times you can have them also write down what they predicted or what they described or what they learned to reinforce not only speaking skills but also literacy skills such as writing and reading. Another thing is you want to encourage and incorporate engaging listening activities with students. So have students listen to songs with lyrics or play listening games or hear books read out loud to them with technology or even listen to different sounds, because that will help them develop their phonemic awareness and also to pay more attention, which will help with their listening comprehension. Another thing is you want to model good listening skills. So you want to teach students what it means to be a good listener and reinforce that by praising students when they are being good listeners. They're paying attention to the speaker. They're actively trying to understand what they're saying. They're asking questions that they don't understand, or they're using gestures to help explain things, or use other phrases to explain things when the communication breaks down. Another thing is make sure that children, when you're reading to them, that you incorporate children in the read aloud. So you can have questions, you can have students do movements with you, you can have students repeat certain parts, or chant along with you, or sing along with you. You can have students turn and talk to a partner. You want to make sure that read alouds are an interactive experience where students are actively involved. They're not just listening to you read the story, but they're thinking about what they're reading, they're talking about what they're hearing. They're maybe acting out what they're hearing or saying it with you. So they're actively involved. That helps maintain student engagement and helps make the activity more meaningful for students. Another thing is you want to make sure that you provide students daily opportunities to draw and to talk about their drawings. And within that, also, especially when they're starting to write, let's say age 4 or 5 and onward, have them not only explain what they drew out loud, but also try to write what they drew and describe their drawing below the drawing, and that can help reinforce their writing skills as well. So we've talked about this a little bit already, but you want to explicitly teach different writing techniques and have different writing workshops. So you want to teach students specific skills like capitalization, punctuation, how to be descriptive, how to be persuasive, like how to write in different genres, like writing to provide information, expository writing, versus writing to persuade others, persuasive writing, or writing fiction stories, how all of these different genres have different elements. Another thing is, we already mentioned this, but make sure you provide your own model of proficient writing daily to students. So you need to be daily writing in front of students and having students give you input while you write down their ideas. And you want to write across the different genres. So you want to not only write expository writing in front of students, but you also want to maybe write a personal narrative that students help you answer, or write a persuasive essay in front of students, or write poetry in front of students. All of these things help develop their understanding of different genres and models fluent writing. Another thing is you want to make sure that you have literacy games that involve phonological awareness. There's lots of games that you can order with your class money, or even you can look up on, let's say, Teachers Pay Teachers, and you can create yourself, where students are practicing with different spelling patterns, different blends, like the long A, or different long vowel sounds, like the long A sound. You could have them do like word sorts or matching. Another thing is you want to make sure that when you're reading, you want to call attention to particular parts of speech, like certain spelling patterns, like the BL blend, or the SP blend, or different capitalized words and why they're capitalized, or contractions in their reading, or bold print. All of these things you want students to actively notice and pay attention to, and you can use them as teachable moments so that you can call their attention to that, so that they recognize how the different elements of speech and the different elements of phonics relate to what they're reading. You also want to make sure that students are doing learning activities and assessments, so quizzes and tests and projects to assess their learning, that have all 4 language domains. So in some way, students should be listening. They could be listening to each other. They could be listening to the teacher, listening to a book read aloud to them. They should be speaking. So they're speaking to their peers, to the teacher, doing a presentation. They also need to be reading during the activity or the assessment. They need to be reading different texts, different words. And finally, they also need to be writing. So whatever assignment you give students, either be an activity or an assessment to gauge their learning, you want to have elements where they're doing all 4 of those skills. They're listening, they're speaking, reading, and writing. Another thing is, based off your assessment data, you're going to track students' abilities in their listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and you can monitor their progress and share this progress with not only the student and the parents, so the student can get encouraged to see how much they've grown in all 4 language domains, but also showing to the parents how the parents can help support you at home and reinforce some of these concepts. So let me give an example of an activity or an assessment that has all 4 language domains. So let's say you were giving students a practice activity related to a science experiment. Well, you might have students obviously listen to your instructions, talk to their partners, speak with their partners, and which would practice both listening and speaking. You might have students read the directions to the experiment, maybe read a short article about the experiment and the purpose of the experiment, and then finally write down what they learned from the experiment or their conclusions, or do a lab report. All of these things would include all 4 language domains. The same thing could be said for an assessment. So when you're giving students an assessment, you want to give them, let's say even a math assessment. You could give them an assessment where one part they have to solve one problem with a peer, and it's a challenging problem, and both the peer and them have to discuss their path, their strategy to solve that problem, and that would practice their listening and speaking skills. Then you might also give them a few word problems that involve reading. And then finally, you might give them another problem where they have to solve the problem and write an explanation for how they solved it and how they know they're correct. So that would be one example of having using all 4 language domains in math. And you could do this, of course, with language arts as well. You could have some activities where students maybe listen to a passage read out loud to them, and then they answer questions. So that would practice their listening and reading skills. You might have students do an oral presentation of the book they read to the class. That could be part of your assessment. That would help also reinforce their speaking skills and listening skills. Then you might give students some original passages or original books and have them read them on their own, and then maybe answer some multiple choice questions, some short answer questions, some fill in the blank or matching questions. And then if you give them short answer questions and essay questions where they write about what they read, that will not only reinforce their reading skills, but also their writing skills. So that would be a multi-dimensional assessment that would use all 4 language domains. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it. And stay tuned for another video coming up.